deeper than conditioning installed at other times. This was why all his big speeches were organized at night.
So Aldous Huxley right now is referring to Hitler and his speeches and how it affects suggestibility in human beings.
Night. He speaks of this quite frankly, of course, in Mein Kampf. He says this was done solely because people are tired at night and therefore are much less capable of resisting persuasion than they would be during the day. And we see in all his techniques, he was using, he had discovered intuitively and by trial and error great many of the weaknesses which we now know about in a sort of scientific way, I think much more clearly than he did. But the fact remains that this differential suggestibility, this susceptibility to hypnosis, I do think is something which has to be considered very carefully in relation to any kind of thought about democratic government. I mean, if there are 20% of the people who can really be suggested into believing almost anything, as evidently they can be, then we have to take extremely careful steps to prevent the rise of demagogues who will drive them on into extreme positions and then organize them into very, very dangerous armies, private armies, which may overthrow the government.
Okay, that was a mindfuck because I was thinking that he was talking about the government because they clearly use these methods, and then he twisted it around and said, but maybe he's talking from the point of view of the politician. Let's listen.
Well, this, as I say, is in this field of pure persuasion. I think we do know much more than we did in the past, and obviously we now have mechanisms for multiplying the demagogue's voice and image in a quite hallucinatory way. I mean, the television and the radio, Hitler was making enormous use of the radio. He could speak to millions of people simultaneously. I mean, this alone, of course, creates an enormous gulf between the modern and the ancient demagogue. And the ancient demagogue could only appeal to as many people as his voice could reach by the yelling at his utmost, but the modern demagogue can touch literally millions at a time, and of course with the multiplication of his image he can produce this kind of hallucinatory effect, which is of enormous hypnotic and suggestive importance. But then there are various other methods which one can think of, which have, thank heaven, as yet not been used, but which obviously could be used. There is, for example, the pharmacological method. This was one of the things I talked about in Brave New World. I invented a hypothetical drug called Soma, which of course could not exist as it stood there because it was simultaneously a stimulant.
Soma is a drug that I've heard of fairly recently, and addicts love it. I could look it up. I don't know anything about it, but it's not a good drug.
Stimulant, a narcotic, and a hallucinogen, which seems unlikely in one substance. But the point is that in several, if you applied several different substances, you could get almost all these results even now. And the really interesting thing about the new chemical substances, the new mind-changing drugs, is this, that whereas if you look back into history, it's clear that man has always had a hankering after mind-changing chemicals. He has always desired to take holidays from himself. But and this is the most extraordinary fact of all, is that every naturally occurring stimulant, narcotic, sedative, or hallucinogen.
Imagine needing to take a holiday from yourself every fucking weekend. Every weekend you're in bars taking a holiday from yourself. Imagine hating yourself that much, right? That you don't want to identify with yourself. I can't imagine that personally, but I know plenty of Americans that do. And that simply means that you're not doing the work required to want to sit inside of yourself without altering your mind. And I'm not that weak, so sorry if you are, and if you're offended. I'm really not sorry, but it's the truth is the truth.
Was discovered before the dawn of history. I don't think there's one single one of these naturally occurring ones which modern science has discovered. Modern science, of course, has discovered better ways of extracting the active principles from these drugs, and of course has discovered numerous ways of synthesizing new substances of extreme power. But the actual discovery of these naturally occurring things was made by primitive man, goodness knows how many centuries ago. There is, for example, in the underneath the lake dwellings, the early Neolithic lake dwellings which have been dug up in Switzerland, we find poppy heads, which looks as though people were already using this most ancient,
Switzerland,
powerful and most dangerous
country that's never been to war. I wonder why.
Before the rise of agriculture, so that man was apparently a dope addict before he was a farmer, which is a very, very curious comment on human nature. But the difference, as I say, between the ancient mind changers, the traditional mind changers, and these new substances, is that they were extremely harmful, and the new ones are not. I mean, even the permissible mind changer, alcohol, is not entirely harmless, as people may have noticed, and the other ones, the non-permissible ones, such as opium and cocaine, opium and all its derivatives.
Alcohol is a slave's liquid.
They rapidly produce addiction, and in some cases lead at an extraordinary rate to physical degeneration and death. Whereas these new substances, this is really very extraordinary, that a number of these new mind-changing substances can produce enormous revolutions within the mental side of our being, and yet do almost nothing to the physiological side. I mean, you can have an enormous revolution, for example, with LSD-25, or with the newly synthesized drug psilocybin, which is the active principle of the Mexican sacred mushroom. You can have this enormous mental revolution with no more physiological revolution than you would get from drinking 2 cocktails. And this is really a most extraordinary fact. And it is, of course, true that pharmacologists are producing a great many wonder drugs, which where the cure is almost worse than the disease. Every new edition of medical textbooks contain...
Who said the cure can't be worse than the disease recently? That's your test. I'm going to sign off because naturally shorter videos are easier to digest, and I have some things to do. So enjoy.